His new book is called The Generals, American Military Command from World War II to Today. So let's get back to your book, The Generals. You write about the military command during that era. What do you think of today's military command? I know that's a general question, but I'll ask it.
I think it's actually a good question, and it's a question that we should be asked. Leadership. I think we were so snake-bit by the way we treated the military during the Vietnam War that we have kind of come to venerate the military and just sort of cheerlead for it, which is not that good either. We've overreacted to the bitterness of the Vietnam era. Yes, support the troops, but one way to support the troops is to question the military leadership. Right now, we have soldiers who are very good. They're as effective as probably any soldiers we've ever had. They are well-trained, they're well-equipped, they're cohesive. They are so tactically magnificent, in fact, that they kind of make it possible for our military leaders to be strategically sloppy. If you'd been sending draftees into Iraq, we would not have drifted in Iraq, I think, like we did for so many years. We fought in Iraq ineffectively longer than we were in World War II. It was not until early 2007 that we began operating effectively in Iraq, 4 years into that war.
What does that have to do with having effective soldiers?
Well, we had very effective soldiers, and that kind of made it easier for generals to be sloppy, because you knew that the soldiers would kind of bail you out. They'd be so good, they'd fight so well, they'd fight so effectively, that even when their leadership wasn't good, they would soldier on. They weren't the draftees of Vietnam who would throw down their weapons and say, this is nuts. They would figure out a way to bail out their generals, to win battles, even like in Fallujah, that we probably should not have been fighting in the first place. So, as a country, we have given our generals a free pass that they shouldn't have, and it's not helpful to the military to have. They certainly didn't have this in World War II. We need to ask our generals tough questions. We need to encourage them to think, to be strategic in their thinking, to be more careful in their thinking.
You think that we should have a draft in the United States, a draft that would function differently than the draft of the Vietnam War era. Why do you want to reinstitute a draft? And then we'll talk about the shape, if it was your job to reinstitute the shape you'd want it to have.
The reason I think we should have a draft is there is a basic disconnection now in this country between the population and the wars we are fighting. There are two 1% in America, and I think these things are related. There's the 1% that is grabbing all the wealth in this country right now. And then there's the 1%, a different 1%, that fights our wars. The 1% of the country fights our wars, and the 99% of the country is not affected by them at all. That is no way for democracy to conduct itself. It means that our wars are conducted with some inattention, that our politicians aren't pushed by our people, and our politicians don't push our generals to fight more effectively, to terminate our wars more quickly, and our wars tend to drag on, to dither, and to be led by mediocrities conducting mediocre campaigns. If you had a draft, you would reconnect the people to the wars they fight, and they would be a lot more interested in the military, they'd pay a lot more attention, they would not stand for the kind of organization men leadership you see in the Army in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan.
So how would you structure it? What would the options be?
If I were king for a day, I would structure a draft very unlike the Vietnam era draft. It would be universal. There'd be almost no exemptions. You would draft men and women. There would not be any college exemption. However, being drafted would be like winning the lottery. If you got drafted, you would have a free ride through college and probably concessions in the rest of your life on things like mortgages and so on. Not unlike the VA stuff you get now. But I'd also have a second option, which is, hey, you don't want to go fight, we understand, we'll come up with alternative service. There's a lot of things in this country that people could do, and I'd give them somewhat longer term of service and somewhat fewer benefits. So you get some nice help on college, but not some of the other benefits. And I would have a third option, the libertarian option. We have a great tradition of libertarianism in this country. You don't want to serve? You don't want Uncle Sam bothering you? Not a problem. Just don't be asking Uncle Sam for anything. So, no college loans, no mortgage subsidies, nothing from Uncle Sam for the rest of your life. You can drive on our roads, you can breathe our air, but don't be expecting Uncle Sam to help you out. If at age 50 you decide you're wrong, you can come in and join the military, drive around a general for a couple of years, not a problem.
General George Patton was one of the most famous generals in World War II, and part of the reason why he's remained famous is George C. Scott, who played him in the film. What's your opinion of Patton as a general?
Well, first of all, I love the movie. Little known fact about it is that Francis Ford Coppola wrote it. And it's a well-done movie. And actually, I think in some ways it's the first of the Godfather movies. Remember that the whole middle part of the movie Patton is set in Sicily. And I think that's where Coppola begins thinking about the Godfather movies.
Interesting.
I went back and watched the movie, actually, when I was writing the Patton section of the book. And I was surprised, actually, at how much of the dialogue actually comes from the histories that we have and from various documents and so on. A lot of those words are Patton's words. The difference is George C. Scott had this sort of barky, growly voice. And George Patton, little known fact, had a high, squeaky voice, almost cartoonish voice. He was a funny guy, Patton. He was kind of nuts, but at the same time was a very effective combat leader and really one of Eisenhower's oldest and closest friends. At the beginning of the war, it's Patton who's the senior commander. Eisenhower writes him a pleading note saying, if you get a division, I hope you can give me one of your regiments. Of course, the tables are turned later on. Eisenhower looks out for Patton, preserves him through a couple of really notorious incidents, most of all slapping soldiers with PTSD, basically, combat fatigue, who are hospitalized in Sicily in August 1943. But even Ike couldn't preserve Patton the whole way through, and Patton gets fired shortly after the war ends. It's interesting, though, reading Ike on Patton, he doesn't call him a great combat leader, he doesn't even call him a great attacker, and they knew that Patton would not be good in the defense. What Patton was good at was one really unique thing, which is pursuit of a retreating enemy. But Marshall and Eisenhower knew that at some point in the war, we would be pursuing the Germans across Northern Europe. And they kept Patton's career alive for that specific purpose, and he was great at it. That was Patton's great moment, when he pursued the Germans across France in the summer and fall of 1944. And for that, he'll always be remembered as a great general.
What was he fired for?
Ultimately, he was fired because he kept on shooting his mouth off, even after the war was over, and talking about how maybe the Nazis weren't all that bad, and the Jews were kind of disgusting. And he said things like that. And he hated all these refugees. They were just stupid, and we should get rid of them, and stuff like that. And, of course, we need to get ready for war with Russia. And the combination of just his inability to shut his mouth up, just to shut his mouth, is what ultimately meant that Eisenhower had to get rid of him. But Patton illustrates another aspect of World War II that I think is forgotten. Marshall and Eisenhower didn't just treat generals like interchangeable parts. You're the next senior guy in line, so you get it. You're entitled. They picked people specifically for specific jobs. Marshall knew going into World War II that, A, we would go to war unprepared, because we were so far from other fighting countries that we wouldn't feel a need to get prepared. And second, we would have to fight overseas in concert with allies. And so he specifically looked around for what sort of general would be good at that. Patton obviously was not your choice for that. He picks a young officer, Eisenhower, who as late as 1940 was just the executive officer of a regiment, a lieutenant colonel. Marshall promotes Eisenhower very quickly from 1940 before the war begins, because he's looking for a guy who can go in, work with allies in a cooperative way, be optimistic, even as we lose our first battles, and be determined and ambitious. And Eisenhower has all those qualities, and Marshall sees that. And it was kind of Marshall's genius to pull up these people early on, younger officers, Matthew Ridgway, James Gavin, and put them in control and let them succeed. And the people that didn't succeed, he fired. And that was Marshall's genius as a commander, which was reward success, punish failure, and try new people.
Well, Tom Ricks, it's been great to talk with you again. I really want to thank you.
You're welcome. I love being on Fresh Air.
Tom Ricks is the author of the new book, The Generals, American Military Command from World War II to Today. You can read an excerpt on our website, freshair.npr.org. Ricks is a fellow at the Center for New American Security. Coming up, our linguist Jeff Nunberg considers some of the British isms that Americans are picking up on, inspired perhaps by shows like Downton Abbey. This is Fresh Air.
And this is